Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Mr. Copper, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show. I'm going to have you reintroduce yourself, but then we're going to cut right into the meat and potatoes of this episode, which is something that I would say you created it. So technically you found it, you're pushing it out there now, but can you explain a little bit about yourself and then a little bit about what we're going to be talking about?
Well, I will, but first of all, I have to say, Robbie, I really appreciate you having opportunity to come on and talk about this. And a lot of people out there that want to talk about ADHD are all talking about the easy way out. And you're like really a thought leader to have me on to talk about what the future looks like. And so what I'm here today to talk about is in the world of ADHD, we have addressed it based off of what we see and behavior, because that's really all we had. About 12, 13 years ago, Dr. Russell Barkley actually came in and said, there's really no definition for executive functions. And that's a problem because if you have no real definition, there's nothing you can do with it. So he devised his construct and defined executive functions very, very specifically. And I've been studying his model for about 12 years. And the thing is incredibly brilliant because if you understand how he defines it, the way he defines executive function, it has repeatable patterns that's explained by the model, and you can begin to understand a lot about executive functions, like how certain executive functions fight each other. Now, that's kind of high level for other people, but really what I'm saying here and what I'd like to talk about is we now have the technology to go about helping people with ADHD in a way that's never been done before. Put more simply, we have the technology where we can start to take an engineering approach to helping people with ADHD accommodate executive function impairment. A lot of people don't really want to understand the ADHD is a deficit of attention. That's a negative, but it's actually an impairment. The thing about impairments are interesting is because while if you have an impairment, you can accommodate, like my eyesight is impaired. If I accommodate it with glasses, I can read and I can achieve my potential. So the idea is I'm excited today to talk to you about, this concept that we have tools and things that we can begin to use that can revolutionize the way we go about helping people, those with ADHD. And along the way, we can start to explain a lot of stuff that is out there that's more emotional based and be able to talk about kind of what's really kind of going on, if that makes some sense.
Just so I can get a little background before we start getting into what it actually is. But when did you come up with this concept? When did you start noticing that out of all the models that there is out there, that there was this certain thing that could actually go above some of these?
So, and help me out here because you're tuned into your listeners, but at the end of the day, I'm really all about observations. And I noticed that a lot of what we were saying about ADHD wasn't working, or it didn't work 50% of the time. And I always had this thing, if the obvious solution isn't working, then you're paying attention to the wrong thing. And so that's the backdrop of everything. And I started wanting to understand like why things were the way they were, what was really going on. And so that was really the curiosity that I had probably 2010, 2011, that really led me into this area of just curiosity. And the other thing too that was interesting to me is attention. Attention is a hard thing to define, but we use it all the time. And I didn't really understand attention and really what it was. And it's a very cerebral type thing. So I embarked with this notion that attention, what is it? And we're pay attention to things and they're not working. Kind of what's all that about, which is kind of nebulous. But it was in 2010, 2011, I saw Dr. Barkley presenting at a conference. And basically he was saying at that time is that we know that executive functions are in your prefrontal cortex. We know that that's kind of where we are. We know that ADHD really is an issue with executive functions. And he came up with 7 different ways to argue from research that it had to be an executive function in the prefrontal cortex. However, if you took a test just and for executive functions and you had ADHD, it didn't show up as an impairment. And his issue was either it's not an impairment or the tests were wrong. mean, that's kind of a bold statement by saying, oh, the tests out there aren't right. And I'm sitting there listening to him, and Dr. Charles Parker is sitting next to me, and he and I are looking at each other like, whoa, this is interesting. And he said, Dr. Barkley said, he went out in literature, and there was like 32 to 34 different definitions of executive function. As he said, it was a dog breakfast. It's almost like anything goes. So he set about and said, listen, we need precise definitions to determine what is and what isn't, because if we don't have those definitions, we don't really know what it was. And so he said, where do we start? And all the experts agreed that self-regulation is a big one. Now, self-regulation is the ability to override your urges. Basically, impulsivity is the inability to override your urges. So he started there and defined his model. And that was the beginning of me getting like, wow, this really makes a lot of sense. I knew that there was something to it. I didn't totally understand it, but I started studying it a little bit more and more. So that was the impetus of it all. You with me so far?
Yeah.
All right. So then I was sitting there one day, like, what is attention? What is attention? And I really kind of, I was missing something. And I remember, I talk out loud to think. I've got a lot of people over the years that I kind of talk to. And I called my mother one day. I'll never forget. I'm in Tampa, Florida. I was driving carpool. It was 7:30 in the morning. I was on a Zeal. And I was talking to my mother, and I was like, what is it about music that makes it the universal language? Like, what is it? Like, I didn't know. And Lord knows my mom, I mean, she plays the piano, organ, and she's just putting up with me, whatever. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it hit me. When you hit a C note on a piano, we all experience the same vibrations. If you hit a D note, there's vibrations. I'm not so sure we all experience the same, but there's a relationship between those two. Then I began to realize the reason that music is a universal language is because when you're in the experience, it's the same for everybody. And that was a light bulb moment for me. Didn't quite know what to do with it, but I was like, wow, that was really interesting. So then what happened is the idea of an attention exercise came to me. And so over the years, I've developed some things where I realize is too often we will use a term, explain it, and people misinterpret that term based off of their belief system or their feelings or something. It skews the interpretation of it. But again, really, I had to reverse it. I needed to put somebody in an experience, explain the process, and then I could name it. All right. So for grins and giggles, let's just do a little attention exercise. Robbie, do you remember exponents when you were in school?
Yeah, it's been a while though.
Like 2 to the power 3 is 2 times 2 times 2, which would be 8, right?
Yep.
Without using your fingers, can you calculate 3 to the power 5?
Ooh. Damn, I can't believe you put me on the spot on that one.
You're
Nah,
doing great so far.
20. I can't tell you. My brain's not working for that. I just worked an overnight shift. I'm gonna blame it on that.
All right, that's fine. So here's the thing. When I do this with people, I'll say, do you see how you've got 3 times 3 is 9, times 3 is 27, times 3. Now we're getting into a more difficult calculation. Understand two things are happening. Number one, you're having to do the calculation and you're having to remember the number of times that you've multiplied times 3. Not everybody, but most people struggle when they get the 3 times 27 to get to 81, all right? Now, the thing about it is you're having to use your working memory to load those numbers, do the calculations, keep track of the numbers in order to achieve a goal. That is the answer, which is 243, okay? When I put you into that exercise, basically I'm saying you're using your executive functions, which is a set of mind tools, all right, in order to get to that calculation. That's working memory. Now, it's impaired if you have ADHD. That exercise, as a general rule, is more difficult for people with ADHD. If you did it on a piece of paper, it would have been a piece of cake because you would have been doing it outside of your head. Doing it inside your head is difficult, all right? If you would have said 3 times, if you actually would have said the words out loud, it would have made it easier too. But you'll notice I asked you not to use your fingers because you'd be able to keep track of the number of times you did 5. But here's what's really, really cool, and this is what was wonderful, is that when people don't realize ADHD is a thinking impairment. When something is uncomfortable, there is an emotional urge to escape. By the way, emotions is an executive function. So when you see somebody with a focus problem, often they're doing something because there was something that required thinking that was uncomfortable, and there was an emotional urge to seek comfort. What was really cool about you is you said, oh, damn. When I presented this to you, you had an emotional reaction and didn't even try. Now, if you really think about that, that's a great way to see, oh, thinking inside my head is really, really, really difficult. And emotionally, you kind of escape. Now, you can begin to understand that, oh, that's interesting. So now, understanding the model that I've explained,
I think in my opinion, I think you just expose kind of like a weakness, which is not like, I'm not saying you put me on the spot. I'm saying like when I try and look at like, I think that my brain works normal just like everyone else's, but then when you're actually able to find out what your limit is and you kind of just look at it, you go, oh wait, I do have one, and I'm not good at that. And it is the working memory where it just fleets away.
but hang on a second. Look at it this way. Doing it inside your head is the impairment, okay? My eyesight is impaired. If I put on my accommodation, I can do it. If you would have written it down, you could have done it.
Yeah.
You see the difference?
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to just jump forward. This starts to explain all kinds of stuff that wasn't explained before. So this is classic ADD. I need to write a blog, which, by the way, I tell people, if you understand this model, you begin to realize that the majority of procrastination is rooted in ambiguity, right? People don't see the ambiguity, but here's how this works. You got somebody with ADHD and they need to write a blog, so they schedule it for Thursday at 11 o'clock. They know what a blog is, and they put it in their planner for 11 o'clock. Thursday comes and goes, and they didn't write the blog. Why? Well, they have a topic, but when I gave you a 3 to the power of 5, you had to use your working memory to solve a problem. You had to calculate those and hold those. When you've got lots and lots of thoughts that you want to condense into a blog, you got to take them in your mind and you got to figure out which ones to keep, which ones to get rid of, how you're going to put them in order to get to the output that you're looking for. Okay. That's cognitively difficult. And there's an emotional urge to escape. So you'll find yourself either on social media or doing other things on Thursday that are not as cognitively difficult. Now, why is this a big deal? Well, because in the field of engineering, you identify what the root cause of the problem is and you solve for it, right? In this situation, the procrastination or the lack of writing a blog is, I need to write a blog, you know what that is, but I don't really know what to say. I am not able to put those words together. We've got to accommodate that. That's the problem. How do you do that? Well, you might sit down with somebody and talk out loud. When you're talking out loud, by the way, I'm jumping around on this, but nonverbal working memory, which is basically self-talk, is an executive function. Because it's impaired, many people with ADHD, they talk out loud to themselves in front of other people. They don't know that they're doing it. But not to talk for many of them is not the thing. Now, understand when I'm talking to people, often I'll talk and solve my own problem because I'm thinking out loud. Other times I'll talk and you'll say something that will solve my problem. Other times we'll talk, you'll say something and it will trigger a new idea in my mind that will solve that problem. So the idea here is if you understand that writing a blog is cognitively difficult and there's some ambiguity to it, and you accommodate that by providing resources to collaborate, you might find that the thinking is easier, relieving the burden, and you actually write the blog on Thursday. But most people don't think in terms of that. I know what a blog is, so I know what I need to do. But at the end of the day, it's you don't really know, and you need an accommodation to help make the thinking easier. That's where accommodating the impairment comes in. So this notion of a program that I've developed called cognitive ergonomics from the inside out is about helping people begin to understand their ADHD as an impairment and begin to understand that it needs to be accommodated and be able to advocate for what they need to make it easier. Does that make sense so far?
It does, but I don't know how you get society to do that. I mean, unless you made an effective model that would want to be implemented everywhere, but there's still a large amount of people that don't really recognize the difference between a neurotypical and someone with ADHD.
But here's the thing, we never had the technology to be able to bring tangibility to it. Now we do.
And do you think that education systems and things like that will implement it?
The issue really is do you think industry is really going to implement ergonomics? By the way, the field of ergonomics is a subfield of systems engineering. Systems engineer, they design processes, organization. When they design a process at the end, it's about fitting the job to the user. Ergonomics, like those chairs right now, they adjust the arms and height and back. The chair's got to fit the person. Why? To increase safety, to increase productivity, and reduce stress. That's a whole field of engineering. It's been around for a while, and we're actually pretty good at it. The notion of cognitive ergonomics, that's a little bit more difficult because cognition is intangible. I'm saying for the first time that we have a definition of it and we have a means to see it. So for the first time, we have a field of engineering that can begin to study this. If we can bring tangibility to it and justification to it, we can begin to understand it has to be done. Like years ago, he had to put ramps in to accommodate people with handicaps. They're very productive people, but we got to be able to give them the tools and the means in order to kind of get to work. People with ADHD are more or less intelligent as everybody else, but sometimes we have to give them accommodations for them to flourish. So I'm grateful because you're letting me on for the first time. I'm talking about, I think we have a model. I've developed this thing called an attention scope, which is a means to help people see it. The 3 to the power of 5 was for you to experience what it's like to use your working memory, to know that it's impaired, but actually see how your emotions, which is an executive function, had a reaction because it was uncomfortable and you escaped it. Logically, now we can begin to see that if we were to accommodate the thinking, then there's less of an urge to escape. How do we accommodate it? We need to externalize the thinking, give you the tools to be able to do that, which we can talk about in a minute. So now for the first time, we have a way to bring tangibility to this and get rid of all the emotional observations and look at factual observations, because the field of engineering is about facts, not your feelings. Make sense?
Yeah.
The program has been interesting because I've run a couple pilots on it, and we're coming up with now that we understand it, accommodations that are not mainstream. In fact, if you go out and you say, hey, listen, this is an accommodation, society's going to fight you because it's new to them. But I feel like we have a new way of going through and say, nope, that's actually, we're bringing the intangible, making tangible, and say, well, yeah, that is a cognitive problem. And I'm happy to give you an example. Another issue is that when I gave you that 3 to the power of 5, if I would have given you 2 to the power of 3, right, you might have been able to calculate that because your brain had the capacity to do that. When I gave you 3 to the power of 5, I increased the load on your working memory, all right? If I said, can you calculate 9 to the power of 5, I would have really increased your load beyond the capability of most neurotypicals, okay? So as we understand this concept while we're increasing the cognitive load, right, it becomes more difficult. Now, in the world of our world today, when I'm going on to a screen, imagine when I was in college back in the dinosaur days, I would read a book and I would highlight it. When I would read the book, the highlighted part is really, really important. I wouldn't have to read other stuff. I just read what I highlighted. Then my eyes would turn to my notes and I would have some stuff highlighted. When I'm trying to reconcile information to understand, to digest it from the book and my notes. I have a target to read, my eyes, and I have a target. Cognitively, I'm just trying to marry those notes together. When I'm on a computer, I've got to read to find the relevant information. It's really difficult to highlight that, by the way. So I'm reading, identifying the relevant information. Then I've got to do something. I've got to a series of instructions. Click on this app or browser, scroll, all right, for what I'm looking for. All the time I've got to hold in my mind what I read. By the time I find what I did, I've increased the load. So on the book, I read it, and then I had the information. When I'm on a screen, all kinds of thinking has to go on between finding the information or retaining the information and finding what I'm looking for. That is increasing the load. And often by the times I get to what I'm looking for, I forgot what I read originally. Okay. I call this toggling. Now, in our world today, nobody factors in toggling. You go to corporate America and people got multiple screens all over the place because they're beginning to compensate for this. Okay. But students in school, I have yet to see anybody with multiple screens. So when you put somebody with ADHD into a classroom, we used to spread it out on tables so my eyes can go all over the place. Now they got these little screens and they're having to toggle all over the place. Now their working memory is already impaired. Now we're using a device that's increasing the load on what's already impaired, right? It becomes emotionally uncomfortable and there's an urge to escape, right? It's one of the things that's really funny to me is I got a inquiry to advertise on my podcast, and the organization was heralding how they had this great app for people with ADHD and neurodiverse because it was visual. And I took a look at it, and the concept of visual, there's something there because of visual imagery. But the app, the mere device that they were delivering on it was rendering everything that they were touting ineffective. But they were claiming that this was ADD friendly, but the device was creating the problem. And they weren't able. I can bring tangibility to that now and explain why it's not going to work for most people because of the working memory and the cognitive load. I can also explain why students, like in school, should have multiple screens. I can also explain why a lot of times you go to colleges and printers are available, but they're very difficult to get to. Many people with ADHD need to print it and highlight it so that they can see it. My younger son doesn't have ADHD, but he was in high school. And like in the old days, I would like print like Spark notes or whatever, and I would highlight them as I read, and then I would read through it and study it. The highlights are the important part, so I'm able to filter some things down. My son was struggling immensely, and there was a book that he had to go through, and he was clicking from screen to screen to screen, like each page is another screen. And literally one day he was struggling in school, and I went and I had to cut and paste all the copy from each screen into a Word document. It took me 30 minutes to do this. It was like 25 pages. I printed it, had him read it, and highlight it. 20 points better on the exam than before. The difference was I took it and I converted it in a way that was more friendly for his working memory. So that technology was actually becoming the barrier. Does this make sense?
Yeah, do you have any models to show that on a larger scale, this would increase a certain percentage of scores if you were going to examine students or something like that? Because I can't get over the concept of you're asking society to use this because it would accommodate people for ADHD and thinking impairments, if I'm not mistaken, which I understand. But if it's not an overall general population's experiencing the problem, most people with ADHD, like myself, have learned that you have to try harder to get to where the average level is or the part where you're trying to get to. So you are the one that has to make the accommodations. You have to do the time planning. You have to do all these. And I don't see society doing that. You can call me a pessimist, but I just
Well, no,
don't.
no, no. But the issue is that there was a period of time where people smoked. I used to be I got out of college, I worked for Aetna. People smoked. We thought that smoking in our mind had to, there's a cost associated with it, but insurance companies weren't going to adjust rates. So I think it was American Express or somebody actually started taking a look at the data. And once they began to realize is that the data showed that, yeah, it costs more money to take care of healthcare costs for people that smoked. Then all of a sudden we had, different rates for people that smoked and didn't smoke, right? At one point in time, a chair was a chair. We didn't really understand it would increase productivity and safety. At some point in time, we got the technology to do that. When we implemented the technology, we were able to get the data, and so we made the adjustments. Robbie, what I'm saying is society's never had the technology to be able to measure this stuff. Now, what I'm saying is we do. Do I have what you're looking for? No. But what I have is the means to get what you're looking for. That's the point. If you do this and there's logic to it and people can do it and the accommodations work, you can actually run the experiments to get the numbers. And I believe that, in any field of engineering, you got to have a model and you got to have a way of looking at it, and then you can begin to problem solve. We have all kinds of fields of engineering right now. I'm saying for the first time, we have what we need for a whole new field of engineering to fit the task or the job to your brain. By the way, I'm coming from an ADD perspective because that's the people. I'm an ADHD coach. The program is cognitive ergonomics from the inside out. It's not just for people with ADHD. It's for neurotypicals as well. You can have a neurotypical and have a slower processing speed, right? Maybe for that accommodations, you got to slow audio tapes down. But again, what I'm saying and what I'm thankful for is this is a new technology. We couldn't do this before because we didn't have what we needed in order to do it. I believe that we do. It's a primitive form now that we can do, but we can begin to do this stuff because this model begins to explain things that were invisible before that now are visible. Now, the thing about it is human beings make observations with our senses, period. Now, in a field of engineering, we got to have some type of technology to aid our senses. So like a telescope, right? We can begin to see things that our senses can't detect. A microscope, an MRI, an ultrasound, regression analysis, okay? These are all tools that aid our senses to make observations. In the world of ADHD, we've all been making judgments off of what we see. I'm saying that we actually have a model that defines executive functions, and I develop a tool that we can begin to see it. So now we have what we need in order to do this type of stuff, to begin to engineer and understand if we do this for this person or that for that person, we can change the task or the job to fit the cognitive behavior of the individual, not try to get the individual to change their cognitive behavior to fit the task. It's good. It's like the world going from flat to round. It's completely opposite the way we had been going about it.
I understand that. I'm just looking at when you mentioned neurotypicals. I mean, would this mess with anything that comes with like social media's ease of access for a lot of us, and it can really distract us if we talk about procrastination, like you mentioned the example about writing a blog. You can go on, you can have independent thoughts that just come out, and it's crazy TikTok is for people with ADHD because they can just create a bunch of stuff that they might regret later. But that's now becoming the norm for everybody. It
Well,
seems like
but
there's
but
a
but
lot of.
but the thing about you have to understand. Have you ever watched The Social Dilemma, by the way?
No, I've heard of it though
Okay,
about Facebook and all that
so let's back
social.
up. Like there's something that's this is kind of complicated for some listeners, but there's a lot of lessons that we can learn, and I want to get everybody. I've given this a lot of thought. Back in the '60s, there was this Joe Camel was cigarette companies advertising to make smoking cool for teens. Turns out nicotine is addictive, right? If we could get somebody hooked on our brand, we've got a customer for life. We got a business annuity. They're not accountable to anybody other than shareholders to get other people addicted to increase revenues and shareholder profit. So the addictive model is an elegant business model. I mean, it's great. If you can get somebody addicted to your product, that's really what you want. We do a lot of stuff in our world trying to get people addicted to what I say, the emotional presence. So like Pepsi presents itself Coke presents itself different. You're trying to get differentiated for people to associate themselves with a product the way they want them to be seen to get some loyalty. But what you really want to do with a project is you want to engineer it so it's addictive. So we do things to food to make it taste better so that it's more attractive. But here's the thing, social media, and if you watch The Social Dilemma, I mean, they're blatantly open. They are making that addictive. They know exactly what they're doing. So they're taking a product and they're making it addictive so that people can't help themselves. And people with ADHD are prey. So like if you take a look at YouTube, you've got a bunch of supercomputers that's watching your every click, and they're beginning to understand exactly what's interesting for you. And if it's interesting and there's a dopamine like drive to this, that persons that are on this are becoming hypnotized. If they're in a trance, they're not even aware of what they're doing because they're being fed a drug over and over and over. It's like Joe Camel, right? They're getting people addicted to it right now, and there's no oversight. Now, in the late 70s or 90s, states started kind of coming in and cracking down and starting suing like cigarette companies for advertising and these types of things. But right now, there's nothing that's out there. And my personal feeling is, and everybody, this is Jeff Copperism, so don't take it to the bank, but the early generation, the kids that are 20, 23, 20, like in that range, Gen Z, I think it is, they're the first generation that has gone through middle school with social media. And we're starting to see a lot of problems with it, a lot of problems, depression, um, social inability, because people are, number one, they're interacting with the world. They're not, it takes effort to go out and see somebody. You can sit on your phone and it's cognitively less effortful, but you're also emotionally judging everybody's outside. People don't live their lives like what they do on social media, and it's manipulated. So, in a sense, if you go back to the model that I've been talking about, is I'm arguing based off of executive functions and people with ADHD, it's disproportionately difficult for people with ADHD to abstain because they have more addictive type behavior. And I'm trying to advocate for, I have a lot of people with ADHD that, they're on phones and saying they're not able to control their behavior. They need to go to a flip phone. And the idea here is there needs to be some type of accountability or some way to mitigate some of this stuff, because sometimes people with ADHD, they just are not able to control themselves. When I was a kid, if I liked something, wow, I want to buy that on the weekend, I had to go to the bank on Monday when they were open, go to a teller and get the money and then go buy it. A lot of times I'd find something by the time it kind of came around, I guess I don't want it. Now I just click on Amazon, it shows up at my door 2 days later. Society has reduced the amount of barriers to make it more difficult for people to self-regulate. So we're off a little bit of a tangent, but my model actually, and Dr. Barkley's model, can kind of explain and advocate why there needs to be requiring people to use apps is actually making things cognitively more difficult for people with ADHD. And there needs to be some type of legislation in order to mitigate that. But to do that, we got to have some scientific way to help people understand that it's cognitively more difficult, which I believe this can do.
How would you, like, if you were going to take this to legislation, how would you, like, what would be an example of something that legislation could do? I mean, you can't ban these companies from using apps. I think that's the biggest problem with like censorship and the amount of power and data that they get from people as well, too.
Well, you could limit access to certain apps. Yeah, like, you can't smoke till you're 16, right?
Yeah.
Maybe you can't be on social media till you're 18. Can't drink
Well,
till you're 21.
oh, that's a challenge right there. Till you're 18 to use social media. They tried banning TikTok.
Remember this, is that nicotine and alcohol are addictive substances. The
Mhm.
idea is we want to extend the age until somebody is mature enough in order to be able to make wise decisions. That's why there's limitations on it, right? TikTok's addictive. Why should we allow a 9-year-old to be on it that doesn't have, the brain doesn't mature until 28. Why should we be allowing somebody that doesn't have the executive function to make wise decisions onto something where they're just not able to they don't even have the self-awareness to realize they're being exploited? A lot of stuff that starts to come out, but the fundamental thing is this concept. We can now take an engineering approach to addressing ADHD and have a model and data and a way to do this to bring data and show why certain people should have certain accommodations to fit the job to their brain is revolutionary, right? Is that, and by the way, extra time on tests is, that's a generic thing that for the most part, most of the people I coach, they get it. Most people actually don't really need it at that level. What they do need is I've had some people that they need the paper test where they can make notes, right? Or they need the ability to walk around, or they need to be able to ask questions to interpret the question, right? Another issue of cognition is that some people are really, really, really smart, but they'll look at a word, right? And they're having a hard time inferring what that word means in terms of that context. When you're in a classroom with a teacher, I remember I used to walk up and ask them a question about the question. And the teacher would give me a clarifying answer. And I could go back and do that. In the world today, you can't do that. It was interesting. I was taking psychology in college, and the teacher was actually, well, okay, well, only 40% of the class got this answer correct. Therefore, it was a bad question, and they threw the question out, right? If I've got a question, I can't ask somebody to see if I'm interpreting it right. It doesn't mean a test is to say, do I have the knowledge? Okay. Being able to walk up and ask a clarifying question to demonstrate my knowledge, I don't know why there's something wrong with that. But in our world digitally, we're putting that off. And people with ADHD, when they're thinking through something, they just might need to be able to ask a question. That's not typically something that people do on tests these days. I think there's a case to say it's a legitimate reason why they should be able to ask clarifying questions. At the end of the day, the test is to demonstrate their knowledge. Make some sense?
I mean, I agree 100%. I mean, even with rereading a question or if someone reads the question too, you can understand the actual thing and then come up with the correct answer. It's not that they were stupid. They understood it. It's just something that process it when they read it on their own, whether they misinterpreted words. But then my thinking about this is that the resistance to that would be the people thinking that it's preferential treatment.
Well, right now they're coming out. There's going to be the resistance. I'm not denying that at all. The issue really is we've got the technology now to come up with the argument to override that resistance. Before, it's just their thought. How do we back it up? We don't have any means to do that. Now we've got the tools that we have in the technology for the field to do these things and make definitions and come up with legitimate reasons why that would be done. In the absence of that, we have to succumb to society because, just like anything else, everything is invisible until you make it tangible, right? Science keeps disproving itself, right? At one point in time, we thought we were the center of the universe. Then we went around the sun. Now we're galaxies. We keep disproving ourselves over and over. People are not going to buy into anything unless they have proof. The point really is now we have a means to bring tangibility to this and proof in order to get the things that we need. It's
Yeah,
really kind of exciting.
I mean, your model isn't what I'm misinterpreting or not understanding. It's just I can't get to the concept of where we can get everyone to agree with this. I mean, we still have people that are resistant to ADHD in general, that it even exists. I get comments on other ADHD episodes. People say it doesn't exist or there's a lot of resistance in that front. And then if you really talk about, I mean, if you show them the data and show them that we're just helping someone get to the same level as an average neurotypical person, it's not giving them any enhancements. People will still want that other type of.
But think of it like this. If we had a definitive test, if you took it, you have ADHD and you don't, people would believe it, right?
I mean, there'd probably still be people that wouldn't, but yeah.
Well, I mean, some people just don't want it to be, but when we have a blood test that's there, it's a definitive test, right? Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess it is. We have a test. We know what strep throat is. We know what the infection. We know that penicillin works. Before that, we didn't really know. Now we have a test, right? We don't have a test for people with ADHD, so people doubt it. All right, I understand that a little bit. I'm saying is metaphorically that we now have something that's there. And by the way, while I'm talking about people with ADHD, the model is used for neurotypicals as well. So cognitive ergonomics is like fitting the job to the user. You might not have ADHD, but still need some accommodations that the model can help explain.
Where would you implement this first if you were going to put it? Like, would you start with education systems? Would you look at a certain career or job opportunity out there in just the workforce?
It's like everybody. I think that understanding the background on this can change how like therapists work, how coaches work, how teachers work, how parents work, but more importantly, industry, businesses, schools. Remember, systems engineering is a field of engineering. Ergonomics is a subfield of it. We don't have what we need for cognitive ergonomics. It's literally for everybody. And it's not just for people with ADHD.
I understand that. I was just asking where would you think who would adopt it the most? If you could give me like an example of who would adopt it the most. First off,
Right now, I'm going to people with ADHD, therapists and coaches, because they're the ones, people with ADHD can benefit the most, the quickest, the fastest to get word out to have this thing grow. So that's where I'm going. I'm finding particularly helpful for therapists and coaches because most therapists and coaches that are really interested have ADHD themselves, but they also help people with it. So that's where you go. What's scary about this is Dr. Barkley is really the guy that brought what we needed. I just figured out a way to bring away a lens to see these things. And at the end of the day, I'm not saying I invented a new field. It was kind of the pieces were there. I just brought the lens to be able to observe executive functions on the individual level. Because as I say, my program is cognitive ergonomics from the inside out. The person has to participate. Person never really know what to look for right now, but now I can begin to bring it tangible for them to go, oh yeah, I don't have the capacity for that, and help them understand like, what helps me is when I'm talking or, I'm reading a book or kind of whatever, so that they can begin to advocate. A lot of times people with ADHD, they want accommodations and the people ask, well, what do you want? And the person doesn't know.
yeah.
The idea here is to have them be able, well, okay, this is what works for me. So at the end of the day, it's really kind of exciting. The challenge of scaling it is, again, you have to become proficient at using attention scope like a radiologist. So you have to go through training to do that. That's the biggest barrier for the scalability of it. But what I'm grateful for is you're allowing me to come on and talk about it because I've been running some pilots on this and I'm getting ready to get the word out in the early stages. And I'm sure what I've come around with can be improved on, but what's exciting is it could be revolutionary. It really could change because it's a completely new approach, a completely new way. It's a much more objective way of identifying what's going on. It also can, like earlier you and I were talking about like overwhelm and information. Like in the model, when the cognitive load exceeds your cognitive capacity, emotionally, you feel overwhelmed. When you're overwhelmed, you have a tendency to just go and hide. Well, the issue really is going to hide is the wrong thing to do. You're overwhelmed is because you have a lot of thinking to do and you don't have the capacity to it. The thing that you got to do is say, I've either got to increase my cognitive load or I got to decrease the capacity in order to solve that problem. Ignoring it doesn't help either way. Probably needs some help from somebody to reduce the cognitive load, but increasing the cognitive capacity is not about just trying harder. It's about getting accommodations to help you think, right? Sometimes getting external people maybe to help you kind of collaborate. That's the point. Another area that's really important is that an emotion is a reflexive response. Emotional dysregulation is a huge issue with people with ADHD. When your emotions are dysregulated, your attention is dysregulated. What a lot of people don't realize, but the model explains, is when thinking is the cognitive load is more than your capacity, it's uncomfortable. And emotionally, you escape. I gave you 3 to the power of 5, and you were like, oh, damn, that was an escape. The thing about people with ADHD is in order to manage it, they have to have self-awareness. And a lot of times they're saying, I feel, I feel, I feel. And what they don't realize is that they're jumping to conclusions. They're not actually thinking. There's a great quote, when thinking's difficult, that's why people judge, right? A lot of people with ADHD, because thinking is impaired, they're quick to jump to conclusions. They're not realizing that they're jumping to conclusion because the cognitive effort of studying it to see that it might be different is too difficult. So they jump to conclusions. Now, sometimes they're right, but most of the time they're wrong. But if you jump to conclusions, you believe that they're right, you'll find yourself painting yourself in a corner after a while. And you and I talked about this, and this is just a meism. There's a buzzword out there called rejection sensitivity. In my world, that's emotional dysregulation, period. But the way this plays out is if you tell a joke to somebody and they don't laugh, a person with ADHD might be quick to judge that that person is rejecting them. Now, here's the deal. If they stop and think, well, maybe they don't have the same sense of humor I do, or maybe they didn't get the joke, or maybe something else is kind of going on that would lead them not to laugh. Those are all legitimate reasons. But the person with ADHD doesn't really exert that cognitive effort to think about that. They're convinced that the person is rejecting them. Well, as you start to look for rejection, you'll see it all over the place because you're misinterpreting it. Then there's an old saying, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks at a nail, you're really looking around for how you're being rejected by everything. And you're actually not able to see anything other than rejection. So it's kind of interesting as you when you name stuff like that, to me, sometimes it puts blinders on people and it digs a deeper hole, makes it more difficult to get out. Now, I know there's a lot of people that will argue against what I'm saying. And sometimes you have ADHD and you might be rejected on some things, but just the emotional side is like, let's think about what you're doing that could cause some of that stuff. And let's have the self-aware to do something about that, because just to go to the emotion and keep doing something that's going to create a problem doesn't solve that problem either. Does that make sense?
It does. I know you're trying to hit some of the topics I mentioned I wanted to talk about, but I'm still interested in your model. When you talk, if this did get implemented and this was accepted and this was used, I mean, if you looked at a small scale thing when you're talking about children with ADHD, if we just focused on that little subgroup, could you see an overall increase or maybe a diminishment of their ADHD symptoms in the way that they are able to understand better in the long-term goals of, I don't know, into adulthood?
Okay, that's a simple question. Here's the thing. There's a lot of people that have ADHD, and if you put them in the right environment, right, that has the right accommodations, the ADD symptoms seem to go away. Is it because they went away or they have the accommodations? It's because they have the accommodations. There's this notion there that was around for a long time that you outgrow your ADHD. I'm not so sure that's accurate. I know this, I've coached a lot of people. By the way, there's many people with ADHD that not to talk is not to think. We call them verbal processors. Coached a lot of people before that were very successful. Now they're in their 40s and they're struggling because they're trying to work out of their house. And I'm like, well, the reason that you were successful is you were in an office and you were talking out loud all day long and you've lost that. You're not talking out loud. So not to talk is not to think. You're in the wrong environment. You were in an environment that had a lot of accommodations that were invisible. You didn't know that. Now you're in an environment that doesn't have those. The issue is that you need to get back to that environment, which, by the way, I'm just reinforcing this, okay? As I've said, ADHD is more of a thinking impairment than most people realize. It's a thinking impairment. Dr. Thomas Brown had a quote years ago that I heard. It made sense, didn't make a lot of sense until now. And he said, as the need for independent work increases, ADHD productivity decreases. Put differently, as you need to think more inside your head without collaboration, the more challenging, less productive you get. So the pandemic hit. I'm thinking, I'm out of a job in 60 days. I'm kind of like expensive, and I got to be like, I'm not a requirement, right? No, that's not what happened. My phone lit up like a Christmas tree, right? Why? Everybody went home. I'm unmotivated. I'm unproductive. No, you lost your accommodations. Now, we make observations based off of what we see. I said, calculate 3 to the power of 5. I could say you're unmotivated to try to do it, or I could sit there and say, emotionally, The reason that you didn't do it was the cognitive thinking exceeded your ability to do it. That's why you didn't do it. Same observation, but now I know the root cause of why you, it's not because you're lazy, it's because there's a thinking impairment. People, it wasn't that they weren't motivated. It's just the cognitive load was more than the accommodative capacity. They lost the accommodations that was invisible that they didn't know was there, right? It was, and I can tell you all kinds of stories. Like I said, most of procrastination is rooted in ambiguity. People don't get that. I had a woman just before the pandemic. I was explaining most procrastination is that she started arguing with me, right? All right, well, pandemic hits and she texts me, "Oh my God, I get it." And the story goes is that she was at work at home doing some stuff and she had a procedure that she could not remember the step. And that moment she realized at work she would lean over and ask a coworker what it was, and she would have gotten it within 2 seconds and been right back to work. Not today. She didn't have a coworker. So she sent an instant message. She doesn't know if the person's on vacation at their desk using instant messaging, or maybe it popped up and the woman's just not, whatever. Anyway, she sat there for a minute or two, went to get a cup of coffee, and then come back for the rest of the day. Now, in talking to her, we realized is that the procedure was somewhere on the company's intranet, but she had no idea where it was. It would have taken a long time to do that. Too cognitively effortful, and she didn't. In this moment, it's just a small 2-second invisible thing around how you can get access to information, remove ambiguity, and it's the difference of a day's worth of productivity and not. These are little things that are almost, I mean, they're invisible, they're intangible. That's why the world isn't getting this, because they look at it and say, well, the person should know, not realizing the cognitive effort that we're talking about. We can now begin to do this and simulate it in ways that neurotypicals can get to justify what we're looking for.
That there actually is a real hindrance in somebody's understanding and their cognitive abilities. I'm supportive of that 100%. I think it's great. I'm hoping that we can actually get people that sit down and want to actually listen to be able to see the evidence of that as well too, which I think is the difficult thing is that a lot of people haven't.
This is where you come in. You reached out to me and I said, I'd like to talk to you about this. And this doesn't fit the mold of what most people are doing, but I'm excited because I'm going out and saying, hey, we got this thing that's really, really cool. And, the more I'm coming out of pilot right now, what I've got is promising. And the people that are going through it, they're like, wow, this is changing the way I'm look like. I'm getting things completely different. If there's nothing to this, it's going to die on the vine. I mean, it's not. If there is something to it, then people like, wow, there's something to this. It will grow and we'll start to get that stuff and we can make some things happen. And for me, the fact that as a thought leader, you're welcome to entertain me coming on and having this concept speaks to you and what you're trying to do for the community. Because, what in a way, I have to sit there and say what we've been doing really hasn't been working. I mean, we learned a lot about ADHD, but the effectiveness of our interventions really haven't kept pace. There's a reason for that, because we're trying to change behavior when underlying we need to accommodate it, but we're not able to get the accommodations because we're not able to be able to justify it more scientifically. Now I think we've got what we need to start down that road to make that happen. And again, I thank you for the opportunity.
No, I'm sure it gets frustrating trying to explain it to someone like myself who's just trying to understand the concept of it. And then, depending on how many shows you got booked up to explain the same thing over and over again. But one thing I like about you is that your style might be a lot different than maybe other ADHD coaches, but I think it's effective because you're actually passionate about what you're really looking into and what you actually like. Same thing for me, maladaptive daydreaming, all these things are out there. Whether you believe in the concept or not, I mean, there's a group of people that do, and I just want to understand it more and highlight those things. But there's not a lot of people that are fighting to do that. They're trying to fix an issue. And I don't think we should be looking at ADHD as necessarily an issue in the sense of an issue. We should look at it as something that's a part of somebody, and we should do what you're talking about, which is find tools to be able to help that person.
And there's a lot of people out there with ADD that are really, really intelligent that are not able to
I'm
blossom.
good if you give me some history questions, but damn it, this one I got me back.
But there's a lot of people out there with a lot of intelligence, but they haven't been able to shine because they don't have the accommodations that they need in order for that to kind of bubble up. And hopefully this is the beginning of a new era. So
Where can people find examples of your model, or people can find some of your work?
my website is digcoaching.com. When you go there, you can access my podcast, my YouTube channel. But right now, if you go to services, There's an area that's cognitive ergonomics that has the fundamentals of the class, stuff like that. Right now, the pilots are done. The people that I don't know, I'm going to be putting testimonials up pretty soon from them. I don't know where, but for the most part, right now, I'm rolling out a class at a time. And if you're really interested, you can get to know it a little bit if you go to Attitude Magazine. Actually, go to my website. If you go to part of the way down, I was very proud. I did a webinar 2 years ago. That was really the early years of what I've got. And it was a webinar that I did with Attitude Magazine. It made a top 25 of the last 23 years of all time. And if they go watch that, a lot of people really, really like it because I talk about some of the executive functions and I start talking about some of the outcomes and stuff that you see. And a lot of people were like, wow, that really, like I share a couple things that the model shows that like how you go about helping people with sleep is very different based off of what we've learned. And so that's a good place that people like, I don't know about this. But if you go check out that webinar, I think you'll find it helpful and get to know if this really makes a lot of sense. And then, like I said, my class is going to be available for the public on a more regular basis in the next two months or so.
I would ask you about ADHD and sleep, about the nightmares, or if anybody experiences any type of research in that area, but we don't have to add that on to the ending. I'm sure it's a complicated topic. But Mr. Copper, no, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk about this model on my show. I'm going to link our links in the description. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for next episode.